this work is so critical. And as Amy said, I'm a bit of a ringer. I've been working in civics for my whole life. So started as a civics teacher and had the privilege, as Amy said, for the last 15 and a half years to work on this at the McCormick Foundation. And I often like to say that this journey is one big civics lesson. And I've had the privilege of doing it at the classroom level and then at the district level in Chicago. I'll touch on that a little bit today, at the state level in Illinois. And now maybe the civics lesson of a lifetime, trying to work on this at the national level. And the thing that it's often been a kind of a bitter irony for me in this advocacy space for civics is that our community isn't all that effective at advocacy. And seems like it's a kind of a critical component of civics. So I've kind of adopted the tagline that we need to do civics for civics, and hope that's a theme that echoes in today's presentation. So what I'd like to touch on is one, just establishing the need. I know in this group, there's probably broad agreement. It's probably why you're here today, but just to kind of anchor some of the challenges we're facing in our democracy and how we think strengthened K-12 civic education can address many, if not all of those challenges. Speak a little bit about a coalition that I was helping to invest in at the McCormick Foundation and now am part of, called Civics Now. Give you an overview of federal policy, major piece of legislation that we're working on, and then how this is playing out at the state level, and then just end with a few ideas where philanthropy is or could invest and be a catalyst for policy change. So starting with the need, kind of the scary statistics that many of us are all too familiar with, and this was actually the Annenberg results from last year were actually a positive development in that a little more than half of Americans could name all three branches of government, but you'll also notice that almost a quarter couldn't name any. So our civic knowledge is alarmingly low. There's deep distrust in our institutions. This shows you our trust in the three branches of government. Only the judicial branch garners a majority of support or trust amongst Americans. And these trends are going in a negative direction. And then, of course, we're in this period of deep political polarization. And we know that actually civic ignorance and distrust help fuel this. This is a graph I often show my undergraduate students, and it's always stunning to me because I look at 1994 as a high point when we were more unified as a country. Remember, this is the year that Newt Gingrich and President Clinton were fighting daily, right? The so-called Gingrich Revolution. Fast forward to the last time Pew did this study, 2010, and this is elite. This isn't elite polarization, by the way. This is mass polarization. And the ideological sorting that's happened in our country, the wide gap between the median Democrat and the median Republican, and it just speaks to how difficult it is to affect change on some of the major issues affecting our country. So all of these trends correlate with a disinvestment and the marginalization of civic education in our K-12 schools. And this is a generational step away from civic education. There's a study by the Council of Chief State School Officers that suggested that 44% of school districts have cut back on social studies and civics in the last couple of decades. So that marginalization is real. We also know that it's a space that's severely undercapitalized, maybe most prominently at the federal level, where we invest $54 a student in STEM education and a nickel for civics. And it shouldn't be all that shocking that young people, their achievement, their demonstration of civic knowledge and skills is alarmingly low. So you may have seen the most recent results of the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics. We only did that test for 8th graders, so we've even cut back on the test, the administration of this test. This is a demonstration of civic knowledge and skills, and about a quarter of young people were deemed proficient in civics. It was actually even lower for American history. And then some major differentials differentials with respect to race and ethnicity, and you can run this by any demographic profile, huge differences in performance. And then you can actually walk this back and find there are highly inequitable inputs with respect to civic education. So not only is civic education marginalized, it's offered in highly inequitable ways, which to me is very anti-democratic. The good news is, so done with the scary stats, I'm going to talk about the good news for most of the rest of the presentation. Frank Luntz actually did a survey with Civics Now last year. He talked to 1,000 registered voters and tried to determine what were kind of some of the solutions to these dilemmas. And the thing that was kind of striking in these findings is that civic education rose to the fore. And notice at the top here, it was the one solution where there was strong bipartisan agreement that civic education was the way out to these challenges for our democracy. Support for some other solutions, but you see the partisan divide, the polarization play out in response to these questions. So what are we doing about it? So the Civics Now Coalition was born a few years back. I have to say, as somebody that's been in the field for so long, it was always frustrating that we really couldn't get our act together. So there were many players, never had enough money, and we were kind of fighting over table scraps. It's a different time, and one of the reasons I was really attracted to this position is iCivics had created this table where organizations from across the country, across the ideological spectrum, we're at 166 coalition partners now, are united around stronger K-12 civic education policies. What I have on the screen are just the A organizations, organizations that start with the letter A in our coalition. And you see some of just the ideological and geographic diversity demonstrated on the screen. What are we trying to do? Talked about this challenge of disorganization. It's pretty clear now that Civics Now is the center of the civic education universe. We're aggregating networks, as I just talked about. We're developing policy alternatives. We offer a state policy menu. We're at the table for the development of the federal policy that I'll speak to in just a bit. We have a state policy task force. We provide technical assistance to state coalitions. We have a federal policy task force that is activating behind the federal legislation. Lots of speaking engagements, many at the state level. And then we do a little bit of lobbying, particularly on the federal bill. So that's what Civics Now is doing. And what's our theory? The theory is that if we have stronger federal and state civic education policies in terms of course requirements, instructional time, accountability measures for schools and students with respect to civics, that will create demand for more civics programming, professional development. When I was wearing the hat of a philanthropist, to me, my secret sauce was always teacher professional development. If we improve the practice of teachers, we could improve teaching and learning in the classroom and ultimately affect student civic development in a highly positive way. So that's the theory. A little bit on federal policy. So I alluded to the fact that we have a big federal bill. It's a transformational bill called the Civic Secures Democracy Act. Would represent $1 billion investment over 5 years, so $1 billion a year for 5 years for civics. It's bipartisan. I'll come back to that, but that's a bit of a unicorn in this environment also. And it's a very positive frame, right? We're expanding access to history and civics. We're protecting our constitutional democracy, and we're empowering students to be informed and lifelong participants in it. So what's in this bill? So you see at the top our co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors in both chambers, highly respected legislators at the table. The big piece of this bill, 60% of the money actually goes to states. So this bill is an exercise in federalism, and then states in turn pass 95% of this money down to local school districts. Qualified nonprofit organizations also would be eligible for a competitive grant program. That's 20% of the funding. Huge emphasis on that secret sauce, teacher professional development. So much of the work that will happen at the school district level, the services provided by nonprofits. And then there's also an investment in higher education with a focus on pre-service teachers. Much of the focus would be on professional development of in-service and pre-service teachers. 35% of that funding is allocated to HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. A provision I'm very excited about is called the Prince Hall Fellowship, which would address the lack of diversity that we have in our teaching profession, and that diversity challenge is even more pronounced amongst social studies teachers. There's a data infrastructure component to this, so the nonprofit grants have to have an impact evaluation of the projects that are funded. There's also a scale up of NAEP, both in history and civics, so we'll return to testing it in 4th and 12th grade along with 8th grade. We'll do it every 2 years instead of every 4 years, and we'll do a larger sample. So this is a diagnostic test. It's not a high stakes test, but we'll be able to disaggregate data by state, which is really important and powerful. There's also a research component to this in terms of the higher ed grants. So a small amount of the money would support research of what's happening in K-12 with respect to young people's civic development. And then the final piece is there's a plus up to the Madison Fellowship and the Truman Fellowship. I was actually a beneficiary as an educator of the Madison Fellowship, which is a graduate scholarship for one teacher in every state to study the Constitution, get their master's degree in doing that. The Truman Fellowship is a program, a graduate program for students entering public service. So that's those are the elements of the bill. Our goal remains to pass this bill in the current Congress with a strong bipartisan majority, and that's where I'm spending about 95% of my time and energy since that bill was dropped 2 months ago. So if I could delve into state policy a little bit, many of you are familiar with the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, which was also released in March 2nd to be exact. This is a project that culminated over the course of a couple of years, involved 300 stakeholders from across the ideological spectrum, really represents a compromise and provides guidance to teachers, to schools, to districts, to states on how to teach civics and history. So I see it as a remarkable document, a political compromise, right what we need for this moment. So you see some of the elements on the graphic on the left side of the screen. We see this as critical to meeting the needs of students in the 21st century, and need to point out, as is true of the federal bill. So the federal bill, as a rule of construction, prohibits the imposition of a national curriculum. EAD is not a curriculum. It's not a mandate. It's a document, once again, that we hope teachers and schools and districts and states use to strengthen civics teaching and the teaching of American history. Just some of the themes in the roadmap. There's a movement in the roadmap from a mile wide, an inch deep to greater depth. There's a strong focus on inquiry, student inquiry. Integration, as is evident in the teaching of history and civics. You can't separate those two. They're fundamentally tied at the hip. Supports educators in dealing with some of these difficult tensions that we're struggling with as adults in our democracy, and integrates a diversity of experiences and perspectives. So it's really important that our highly diverse K-12 student population, a majority of our students are of color, that they see themselves in our history, they see themselves as participants in the civic life of our country. The roadmap, in my mind, does a great job of that, and cultivates this art of being able to disagree about issues vehemently but civilly, that we can actually build civic friendship across divides, and this sense of reflective patriotism. So those are the themes of the roadmap. What is in it specifically are instructional strategies for all grades K through 12. We have a website of curated examples that once again span the ideological spectrum, and then implementation recommendations for every level that I'll speak to a little bit in part as I delve into what's happening at the state level. Back to civics now, we have a state table, meets on a monthly basis. It's a community of practice, 32 states, you see highlighted in blue on the screen here, are at that table, convene them. We provide technical assistance to these states. We've even been able to pass through some grant funding to the state coalitions through this table. So really excited about how it's going. Actually did a survey right as I came into this role in January, trying to get a sense of what the challenges are to strengthening civic education at the state level. And we found where I started in the introduction that it's competing standards and assessments, it's limited civics requirements that kind of lead the way to the marginalization of this subject, the need for teacher professional development, lots of concerns about indoctrination, suspicion of experiential learning, the polarization of our politics make the teaching of civics particularly fraught, and then of course the lack of funding to implement good policies. So we have put forth at Civics Now, I did this 2 years ago, and we're in the process now of actually revising our policy menu, but we have a state policy menu. We're revising it to get in alignment with EAD. Frankly, the changes won't be dramatic, but some of the key provisions is making sure that we have universal, equitable access to high quality civic learning opportunities, that civics is centered in state standards, that there be considerations of assessment of civics, particularly embedded in instruction, and accountability measures for students, for schools, for districts, and for states. That pre and in-service teacher professional development be available, ongoing, funded, supported by school leaders. That we have programs that recognize school-wide and community commitments to civic learning. And then maybe most importantly, as I alluded to earlier, that we resource policy implementation. So this spring, as Amy alluded to at the top, we've had a lot of activity in state chambers. By our count, we've been following 88 bills in 34 different chambers. And some of these bills drew directly from our policy menu. So we're proud of that. Some significant highlights, of course, our spring sessions of our legislatures are still, many of them are still in session. So we're waiting with bated breath on some of these developments. Biggest win, I would argue, has been in Indiana, where they adopted a middle school course requirement, amongst other things. They passed a bill through both chambers. You're not going to believe this. One no vote as it went through the two chambers was signed into law by Governor Holcomb last month. Utah put in place an experiential civics pilot. Virginia has a law that allows students excused absences for civic engagement activities. Oregon's one of the only states that doesn't have a high school civics course requirement. That bill has passed out of the Senate chamber and is also out of House committee. And Florida has passed a bill with strong bipartisan support that would put in place a civics practicum for high school students. That's passed both chambers and is awaiting Governor DeSantis's consideration. So I'll end with just a couple thoughts for the role of philanthropy as a catalyst for policy change. And one place I can say where we started at McCormick were place-based investments in the city of Chicago. And it took us a while to get to this place, and frankly, for Chicago public schools to get to this place. But 9 years ago at McCormick, we made an investment with other funders at the table directly in Chicago public schools, and piloted a district-wide civic engagement strategy that had staples like a civics course. The district at the time didn't have a civics course, but also scaled up some of the service learning programming that the district was already doing, and integrated a program called Student Voice Committees. So student voice in school governance is a best practice. Integrated that into schools, started very small, and it certainly scaled with continued investments, continued support from the district, but also supported policies. So that kind of early intervention, and just last week I learned McCormick just renewed its support for this program that I would put up against any large urban district in the country. And you see a screenshot here of their strategy that they've deemed ready to engage. So I think an interesting place to invest. Another place I'd point to is on the coalition building side. So back to that survey I did of the states that we have at the table, it's fair to say that most state coalitions are in a pretty nascent state and could use investment, could use staff time, frankly. That's kind of the key variable here. And Indiana really is a great example of how this can play out. So the Lumina Foundation gave the Indiana Bar Foundation a grant to really underwrite a state task force that the Bar Foundation facilitated last year. So you see a shot here of their report. But that, I think, was so critical. They were the building blocks that set the stage for this big policy win this year. So another good place to invest. As coalitions mature, they start to coalesce around a policy agenda. Even when they have some wins, there's clearly a need to continue to convene, continue to advocate, continue to organize. Massachusetts, I would argue, is one of the best examples of this, where you have multiple nonprofit organizations, you have government agencies, State Department of Education at the table working together to implement a landmark law that passed in 2018 that actually has state funding. So just kind of critical ongoing support. Massachusetts is a great case study there. This is a graphic some of you have seen me share before, but was the way I've often explained the implementation work that I helped lead at McCormick, where McCormick was a lead funder. We brought other funders to the table. So Illinois was a state where we were able to move substantial legislation to improve civic education, but funding just wasn't in the cards. So we raised private resources to support implementation. We worked with regional offices of education, including Chicago Public Schools, to implement this law in 3-year cycles, because we actually got a high school law passed in 2015, came back 2 years ago, got a middle school law passed. So did this in concert with regional educational offices. Also had a bevy of civic education nonprofits based in Chicago, didn't have much reach outside of the area. We helped them scale their programming so they could serve teachers in schools and districts throughout the state, and then actually seeded a Train the Trainer program where we took veteran civics teachers, empowered them with professional development, and then had them serve as advocates for this work in supporting teachers in schools in their respective regions with implementation. So huge need for resources on the implementation side. So many foundations I found are wary about investing in policy advocacy. I think implementation is actually a safer place to be. And I think we put forth a pretty good model in Illinois at McCormick for how to do this. Last piece I'll speak of, or opportunity, is around research and evaluation. Civics Now, just a couple of years ago, hosted a convening, feels like a lot longer than that, but a convening around research and evaluation. And it's fair to say that there is substantial research that speaks to the power of young people's civic development in a school setting, and some of the measures, some of the policies that I've gone through today. But there's a need for much more investment. So the ranks of researchers are thin as a result, and this research is very under-resourced. I'll end with a plug. We're actually sponsoring a state policy summit, thanks to support from Carnegie. I saw Andrew's on this meeting. Andrew, thank you for that support. Putting together a state policy summit for September 21st and 22nd. It's virtual. We're going to highlight some of the progress we're making on the federal side. We have a panel of governors, another panel of state legislators, third panel of chief state school officers, and maybe most importantly for this group, a panel on the role of philanthropy in this process. But we really hope the summit is a catalyzing event, a lot of progress to celebrate in 2021, and we want to translate that to even more progress in the 2022 spring sessions in our legislature. So with that, eager to get involved in a conversation about policy, and I think I hand it over to Debbie. Am I right?